All right, so hello everyone. This is a lecture primarily for beginners, but not really. This is crash course in debating, but it's also advanced argumentation for beginners. Let me explain. David and I, my best friend, formulated a lecture that we designed for high school students when we first gave this lecture series in Hong Kong. And we thought together, how could we ever condense the most important topics that we could ever make or that a debater needs in order to grow very quickly in this sport. And if there are any three concepts that I would say any debater should focus on improving and get better at as they continue to train more and more and get familiar with more and more motions, it would be the topics of framing, contextualization, and layering. And so I decided to condense it even further for any high school student, even if you're a beginner, even if you're a novice, even if you've never been in the sport of debating at all. And I hope that if you watch this video or go through even just the middle part of it or even one session of it or one module of it, I hope that you could take the simple lesson that debating is not really that complicated. It is a science, it's an art, it's a performance, but inevitably it's all just critical thinking and a process of unpacking what the debate is really about. And of course, I hope that that's a skill that's universal for anyone, not just for those that want to get deep into competitive debating, and not even just for those that are in British parliamentary debating, which I specialize in, but for those that are here in debating just for the activity and the immersion of what it is like to think like a debater. All right, so there are three parts for this presentation and lecture today. The first is going to be on what advanced debaters would call framing, but what I would call for this lecture as simply as asking the right questions or reading the motion. It's important to read the motion properly. It's important to understand what is going on in the debate and realize that it's not just as simple as X or Y, but it's also something more than that. Second, I'll be talking about how you frame your arguments, which you would also identify as contextualization or setting the debate, explaining what is going on, where the debate takes place, and what are the conditions in which the comparative of the debate is set. And then lastly, I'll be talking about making specific characterizations, which is what I would call the lesson on layering, which is detailing the reasons as to why something is more likely to be true. Not just to be true all the time, but because debate exists in the vast majority of cases, it is on likelihood, which is why we argue things to be more likely than not. So again, before we go into the nitty gritty of each and every module, I want to preface all of this lecture by simply explaining that when we are going through a motion, when we are unpacking what the debate is about, we are doing the exercise of critical thinking. We are asking, what do we need to accomplish so that we could persuade the judge that we are winning this debate? And to do this, we employ certain heuristics, we employ certain critical thinking strategies, and that is what we are presenting in today's presentation. Because there is a science to it, there is a process to it, and that is what we want to work with. So firstly, it's important that we ask the right questions. Any debate, you will be presented with a motion, and the motion will ask you to state whether something is true or to do something and argue as to why a certain policy should be implemented or why something is good for a certain consequence or whatever. For this motion, if it were this house would ban political dynasties from running for office, we would ask ourselves the question of, first, what is a political dynasty? Intuitively, you would know that a political dynasty is a family of politicians or a political family that is in power. You might go further and explain and characterize that this political family might likely be entrenched in power or embedded in power for a very long time, or has been embedded in power for a very long time. And you would argue in this debate, if you were government side or proposition side, that you do not want them to run for office, that you think they should be banned for running for office. And it's not just that the debate is they are bad politicians, which could be one of your arguments, but it is also that they should not campaign at all, that they should not even be on the ballot box. And so when we are unpacking how we should argue this motion, you might intuitively come along a set of reasons as to why political dynasties are probably bad. You might say that they are likely to be corrupt because they associate with themselves and they entrench themselves in power over and over. You might also argue that political dynasties prevent other politicians from running for office because they're very, very popular, because they have name recognition because of their last name, and because a lot of individuals do not see why any opposition party should take over them. And so you might start off your questioning process with asking, when should we ban someone from running for office? And I hope that this question should already interrogate your first argument, because your first argument was premised on, oh, they're just corrupt, they're just bad, they are not productive for our government and our democracy because they always want to gain more and more power, they always win elections because they are popular. But that in itself is not a reason as to why we should ban someone for running for office. Do we just ban someone for running for office just because they are bad politicians? Do we ban someone for running for office just because they are corrupt? That's not really the main question we are asking here, because opposition would run an argument in this debate, or they have the opportunity to run an argument in this debate, and it's not just any argument, it's a very strong argument, that democracy is not always about whether politicians will be good or will definitively be the best at making the best policies for the entire country, but it's about whether they feel that a politician represents them best. And oftentimes, if that overlaps with individuals that have name recognition, that are popular, that they voted over and over again in past generations as previous administrations, that they trust because their lived experience can never be approximated by anyone else because you cannot vote on their behalf, then the spirit of democracy truly is that you should allow someone to vote, and that vote should stand. And so our first argument on politicians being, of course, corrupt, or political dynasties being corrupt and entrenching themselves in power, is not accurate yet. We must specify the question. And so we might ask another question to deepen our first question. Instead of just asking when should we ban someone for running for office, we'll ask the question, even if political dynasties are popular, why should we still ban them from running for office? And here, you might unpack an even deeper reason that you're challenging yourself to reach. That, again, it's not a debate on whether political dynasties are good or bad, or whether they are corrupt or not, but it is whether, even if they are good or bad, or whether or not they are good or bad, whether or not they are corrupt or not, what are the conditions in which we should promote democracy or not? Or, in this condition, or in this debate, whether or not someone running for office promotes democratic representation more or not. And I hope now we've revealed what the deeper question of this debate is. Or in advanced language, it's the question of what is the true comparative in this debate? What is the debate really about? And the question of the debate is it legitimate for us to undermine someone's vote, to stop someone, the public, from voting for a political dynasty in power for the sake of protecting some value of democracy? Right? It sounds kind of counterintuitive. We're undermining democratic legitimate votes in favor of protecting democracy. And that's the question we might want to ask here. We might ask the question, how do political dynasties undermine democratic institutions? we might argue at government side that opposition makes the fundamental mistaken assumption that just because people vote a politician and political dynasty into power, that they always want and always consent to that particular political dynasty to always win elections over and over again, to control government in all of its spheres over and over again. And so if we can demonstrate that this vote undermines, one, future votes of future generations because political dynasties incapacitate opposition movements, and two, because they fail to fulfill their own promises in their campaigns, and they suppress democratic representation by hijacking and controlling electoral cycles and campaign processes, then we can demonstrate that they undermine the very democratic institutions that elect them into power. And so here, of course, there's so many beautiful arguments you can make here. That now we've revealed that, hey, it's not just about a political dynasty being corrupt or not, but it's about, incidentally, how a political dynasty, because of their corruption, right? Number one, we could argue that they hijack campaign processes and financing processes because all the money goes towards them, and they flood information and even disinformation campaigns during electoral processes such that they undermine every other candidate that runs for this office. So it is structurally the case that no other candidate can win this election because they don't get enough screen time because of this political dynasty entrenching themselves in power in the campaign process. Number two, during the administration in which they are in office, they concentrate power, political parties, on themselves, creating super majorities by continuously forcing other candidates to always align with them because they concentrate appointments on the family members. They always appoint cabinet members and individuals who run state-owned enterprises, etc., to continuously allow themselves to gain more power and more money. And then lastly, the future elections become harder to contest because of the previous two reasons that we've demonstrated. Now, again, I want to highlight for all of the beginners out there, whether or not you reach the advanced level argumentation of just giving the many reasons as to how they undermine democratic institutions, the point of the question or the point of this exercise is we want to be very interrogative with our questioning process. We want to unpack what is the deepest argument we need to reach. What is the true debate? What is the true comparative we are asking? And here, the simple question we started off with on whether political dynasties are good or bad, or when we should ban someone from running for office, allowed us to reach the eventual question of how do political dynasties undermine those democratic institutions? And so we don't really need to scrap all our arguments or our initial ideas. Of course, we're still running the argument and idea that political dynasties are corrupt, but we're not making that the center point or the the core question that we are asking or answering in this debate. Instead, we are utilizing our initial idea and we're reframing it. We're repackaging this question under a more precise and more core question for the debate, which is how do political dynasties undermine those democratic institutions? Let's do some examples. I hope this is fine with everyone. We're gonna do a module, and then we're gonna go into a brief set of examples to demonstrate what we wanted to learn here, and then we're gonna keep on going here over and over again. So I'll encourage you now at this point, once I pose the motion and I ask the initial questions, to pause the video at a certain point, and then we're gonna go into the answer or how you would process it yourself. So for example, if the first motion or the first exercise were this house supports nationalism, of course, from our initial, the initial question we were asking or the initial exercise, we know that the debate is simply not about whether nationalism is good or bad. We know that it is not about whether nationalism is good or bad. Instead, we want to ask a deeper question. We might first ask an initial question, of course. We might ask the initial question, why is nationalism important? Or why do states use nationalism, or how do they form nationalism? How has nationalism become relevant over time? And of course, you might generically argue that nationalism is important because of national identity, because of unity, because nationalism promotes a common identity. And you might think to yourself, yeah, this is a great argument. Of course, it must be something about whether national identity is good or bad, right? You might make the argument that being part of a nation is great. Being part of a state is great. Being part of a country is great. Having a nation, a government to align with is great. We follow the same laws. We elect politicians under the name of our country. We segment ourselves against different countries under our name. We protect ourselves on that basis. And of course, that is a great way to formulate your argument. But I would argue it's currently imperfect. It's currently incomplete. And this is because the way you are reading the motion is too superficial, right? Remember, debate is always comparative. Debate is arguing whether something is good or bad under specific terms and conditions, or in debate language, under a certain metric. A while ago, we were not just arguing whether political dynasties are good or bad in general, but we argued whether they were good or bad in the context of democratic representation and in the context of promoting democratic institutions as the way we formulated our argument. So here, we want to look for that metric. We want to ask more questions to unpack what that metric is. And here, you might think, okay, what is the best opposition argument that they could possibly run? And they might run several types of arguments. They might run an argument that says, oh, nationalism is very extreme. Nationalism is very extreme. It's very racist. It leads to isolationism. It leads to discrimination. It leads to an us versus them narrative that says that if you are not American, if you are not Filipino, you do not deserve to be part of our nation, and thus you are lesser. You are deserving of less rights. You cannot vote in our political process, and therefore, that is why you must be given less privileges in our democracy. And opposition might, of course, argue that this is, of course, very, very bad. They argue that it leads to the discrimination of minority groups, that it leads to a segmentation, that some people, because of ethnicity, because of race, are privileged because of nationalist discourse that promotes that to be the case. Or they might argue that it impedes on the process of a common human identity. Because now, certain national identities are privileged and seen to be more important than others. Like, for example, developed nations try and hijack global processes because of how they say that, a white man's burden is simply more important of an obligation structure that we must pertain to as opposed to the developing world, for example, and the nation states that are formed in these places. So it's still based on discrimination otherwise, that nationalism instead impedes on that process. So if you were government side, you're asking the question now, okay, all right, we want the unity argument, we want the national identity argument, but we want it to respond to the opposition case in both instances of whether or not they say that they want a common human identity, or whether they want to reference and represent minority identities, like smaller identities that are also discriminated. In both cases, remember, opposition's argument is that nationalism impedes on that process because of extremism and discrimination and all of those things. So now, we've now unpacked the deeper question in this debate. Pause the video here if you haven't reached it yet. Really think about this for a moment. Alright, if you've paused it, now I'll give you the answer. Now, the question is not whether nationalism is good or bad in general, but the question is whether nationalism as a means of collectivizing is preferable to other collective identities that would have formed absent nationalism. And here you would now argue that absent nationalism, it is quite easy for every regional group, every group that is in power, whether it be states on the basis of white majorities and economic power and class, or on the basis of geographic isolation, on the basis of those same easy to defer to characteristics on ethnicity, race, religion, those collective identities are easier to pertain to absent nationalism because of how easy it is to exploit those asymmetries that will always exist on either side of the house. And so you would argue now that nationalism, compared to any of those collective identities, is the easiest and most compromising collectivizing identity that unifies the population because of a nation and an ideology that is created through history, through struggle, through common problems and common traditions, common cultures that we strive to always align with. And now, because you've asked this question, we now know how to make this argument. We now know that the argument is not just on unifying populations, but it's unifying them at the expense of them differing back to even more violent and more discriminatory tendencies of other collective identities that would have formed otherwise. And now, of course, this responds to both cases of opposition. You respond to the fact that nationalism, in fact, impedes on the process of global identity, and your response to that is that nationalism doesn't do that. It actually moves us closer to that global identity because absent nationalism, it differs back to the most raw and easier to defer to collective characterizations and collective identities that are more violent and more discriminatory. And on the other hand, of course, nationalism is the solution to the problem of those same things. All right? And now, of course, whether or not you're an advanced debater that is able to explain this and how this is done, in response to colonialism, with respect to how a national identity is formed through the processes of, like, let's say, history making, history writing, educational systems, maybe to the extent historical revisionism, or even in the process of creating a common language and all of those other things, whether or not you detail it in that particular way yet, the first thing you wanted to go for is that you wanted to identify the true comparative. And of course, here the true comparative immediately was that nationalism actually resolves those problems rather than enables it to be the case. And that's the core contention in this debate. Second, let's say the motion was this House opposes organized religion. Now, here again, I hope you're getting the hang of the exercise here. The debate is not whether organized religion is good or bad, nor is it about whether religion is good or bad. It is about whether organized religion or religion is good under specific terms and conditions under our particular context. And here, of course, you might start off with a very superficial question. You might ask whether organized religion has promoted more good in the world or not. Or you might even ask a more characterization-based question. It doesn't really matter whether you start with a good question or not. You just want to start with a question that you could work with. You might ask another question on what is organized religion. You might answer, organized religion is a hierarchy. It is a hierarchy structure. It is how religions have organized under larger communities of people, created doctrine that they have codified for many, many years because of the institutionalization of religious structures, and also because it allowed themselves to cement themselves and gain power through, let's say, financialization, concentrating money and resources in charity organizations, or also through simply having structures of hierarchy and power, like having a pope, having a leader, a religious leader, an elder, and being able to dictate those terms and conditions of how the religion should dictate its rules and processes moving forward throughout history because of that power and accountability structure that they allow themselves to pertain to. So here you might have started with that question, you might have defined organized religion, and now you want to make an argument that says that, organized religion is bad, right? Of course, you might say that organized religion is definitely very discriminatory because it's bad for, let's say, minority groups. It impedes in the process of allowing people to define what is valuable to them because someone else defines that for them. And you might do all those other things, right? All the other simple reasons as to why religion might be bad or organized religion might be bad. The question, of course, does not simply stop there. The question has to accommodate the core contention that opposition also might engage the debate with. And of course, opposition might also agree with some of the reasons why religion might be bad, right? Religion can sometimes be oppressive. Religion can sometimes be very hard to access. And religion might not always be good for everyone all the time, right? Religion might not always be good for the world all the time. So, right? So it feels like there's so many multiple debates going on. So if we want to specify one argument and one metric that we could angle our argument towards, right? You don't want to just make a general argument that tackles everything. You want to make an argument that tackles a particular contention. And one of those contentions might be, right? Opposition argues in this debate that religion can be bad. Religion can be discriminatory. Religion can fail to represent the needs of people. So this debate is not on whether or not religion does that or not, but it is about whether organization promotes that to be the case, or the process of organization allows that to be the case. And so here, I hope if you've paused the video and thought about this motion already, now you've unpacked, okay, now this debate can be about whether organized religion undermines personal faith or not. Does organized religion promote a personal faith or not? Does it allow individuals, those that would have otherwise been inclined to seek religious, emotional healing, and emotional purpose on either side, because religion could be important in that sense, does it allow that, enable it to be the case, or does it undermine it to be the case such that they are moved away from religion? And here at government side now, you could specify the argument further. Now your argument is not just that it discriminates minorities, it's not just that it's bad and it promotes conservatism, but it's that organization, because of, let's say, what I was saying earlier, the process of creating strict doctrine that you should adhere to that cannot be contested by anyone in the future with other interpretations, or the process of having a community and a religious hierarchy and someone that is very privileged in power to dictate what is correct in the religion or not, to represent the will of God or the will of religious elders and religious divine people and divine figures. You would argue that itself makes it harder for individual members of that religion to always relate to particular aspects that are more attuned to the signs of the times and the daily struggles that they face, because future generations continuously face different problems, different belief systems, and and religion is not equipped to evolve with those processes or with those identities that are continuously changing. So the argument, again, is not in a vacuum of whether religion was bad in general in that context, but we're angling it towards the process of evolving identity. We're angling it towards the process of personal faith and how someone changes. And so now we've made a more specific, contentious issue in the debate that opposition now has to respond to. Now, opposition, if they were just to run the argument that, oh, religion is unifying and it's great for community in general, now, even if they've had a better argument than the initial formulation that religion could be good in general, right? They did it in terms of community. Now, that argument would still not be enough to respond to your argument on personal faith and on evolving identity. So, I hope you're realizing here that debates are continuously evolving so long as you ask more specific questions. And when you ask specific questions to reach the core contention of the debate, it allows you to identify what the true comparative is. Again, in advanced language, this is the true comparative. It is identifying where the debate's most contentious aspects lie. Next, last example for this module. Let's say the motion was this House believes that states should intervene to slow down the development of generative AI. Of course, I hope everyone here knows what generative AI is. Generative AI includes ChatGPT or includes other technologies that employ language learning models, and of course, different degrees to which artificial intelligence is improving or not. So, of course, the debate here, as we have continuously identified, is not on whether generative AI or AI is good or bad, nor is it whether the development of generative AI is good or bad. And nor, I hope you are also getting the hang of it. It is not also only whether slowing down the development of generative AI is good or bad in general. Right? I hope you're getting the hang of it. The debate at its most contentious core is always about whether states intervening to slow down the development of generative AI does more harm than good. And so, and I don't want to go through all of the nitty gritty of everything that we've gone through initially. You could pause the video here and go through that now. But now, I hope as a beginner debater, you've already identified. Now we could ask a question of, does the intervention of states promote better development of generative AI? Or does it not promote better development of generative AI? Let me start off with a superficial argument, okay? Now, you might start off the question of, generative AI, does it disrupt industries? Does it worsen job losses? Does it actually lead to a better transition into a newer labor market in the future, right? Of course, you might argue that generative AI disrupts all those jobs. People lose a lot of jobs. And the other side might say that, oh no, but you could change those jobs. You could reskill and retrain them. And then maybe one side of the debate is asking a specific question that says, oh, no, if we slow down the development of generative AI, it might allow us to promote a slower regulatory process in which the state could intervene to reskill and retrain a lot of the workers that would have otherwise lost those jobs. And that's a fantastic argument already, by the way. If you reach this point, you're already like better than most debaters in the world, right? I want you to note this is already a fantastic argument. But we cannot stop there. We cannot stop there. It's not only merely on whether slowing down allows regulatory institutions to intervene and make it better, but it's whether states would do this productively or not. And here you might ask the question on, does state intervention promote better regulatory control over the development of generative AI or not? And here, you might say a brilliant argument. This is the most brilliant argument, in my opinion, for this type of debate. That, on one hand, opposition may say the intervention from states is unproductive because they pick and choose certain monopolies that they would protect, right? That they would control because of creating barriers to the industry of other institutions that cannot enter because of the slower development process of generative AI. So those that are already existing players, they control more and more and hold more and more of that market share. And so it becomes harder and harder for us to regulate these institutions. But if you were government responding to this brilliant argument, you might even say and contest that it is exactly the rapid development of generative AI and the lack of state intervention that promotes those same monopolies and oligarchies that are created as a consequence of rapid disruptive development. And it is only when states, as regulated by, let's say, public pressure and accountability mechanisms of government institutions, that we are able to bind agreements and conditions with existing players in the market so that they would be beholden to what we say are the terms and conditions that are dictated by our state institutions and public institutions. So, from just a superficial argument on generative AI causes disruptions of jobs, we've specified it. We've done the first layer of specification saying that it's about rapid versus slow development. And then we've specified that even further about whether state intervention promotes better slower development or better rapid development as a consequence, right? And of course, I'm not giving you the answers yet here. I just want you to keep on thinking about how you could develop the argument and develop those questions over and over again. Because later on, as you advance in your debate career, I hope this exercise for this particular motion, because this is admittedly a very, very difficult motion, I hope as a beginner debater, you're already realizing that when you attain more knowledge on what generative AI is, how states intervene, like, oh, they do it through protectionist mechanisms, they do it through intervening in intellectual property rights, they do it through taxes and other tax incentives and other insurance programs and state welfare institutions, all those other things, right? Those mechanisms are less important right now. Like right now in your development process, they are less important right now compared to identifying that the debate was not merely about generative AI being good or bad. And if you've already reached this portion, I hope you're already giving yourself a pat on the back. This is already fantastic. This is already excellent. You're doing really, really good. So we're going to proceed. Let's go on to the second module. The second module, this is entitled Framing Your Arguments. But again, I wanted to note for beginner debaters that a while ago, what we were already doing is we're already framing the debate. We were already framing the debate. Framing is just explaining what is the debate, right? Why it is important that this is the debate. So a while ago, we have the frame. This is the debate. It is about undermining democracy for political dynasty motion. It is about whether it undermines faith, personal faith for religious institutions and organization. And it was also about whether slow or rapid development is promoted in this particular way if states were to intervene, right? But now, we want to frame the argument, framing our argument within the frame of the debate. And I want to pause and just throw away all the complicated terminology, but just say that what we are doing here is contextualizing. We're just saying what the debate is, where the debate takes place. All right? So when we are contextualizing the debate, we are just explaining why something is important, why an argument we have presented is important in this debate. So if the motion was, this house regrets the glorification of genius, again, if you have done the first module, we now know that the debate is not just about whether genius is good or bad, nor is it about whether the glorification of genius is good or bad. It is about whether the glorification of genius under a particular context is good or bad, or under a particular metric is good or bad. And so, let's say you were to run the argument that the glorification of genius undermines narratives of hard work. Right? Of course, that's a great argument. This is a fantastic argument. Why would we reach this argument? We've reached this argument because you've asked the question that, oh, the narrative of genius is a narrative that competes with other narratives. And one of those narratives might be the narrative of hard work, like how we promote more perseverance and more grit in our students within the educational system. And so you might argue that it undermines the narrative of hard work. It is mutually exclusive to the narrative of hard work. You might say schools reinforce a fixed mindset of intelligence, and schools fail to prioritize non-geniuses that work hard. Of course, this is a great argument, right? You might argue and explain why this is the case for many reasons. You might say, oh, schools reinforce a fixed mindset of intelligence because they say that genius is a fixed characteristic. You either have it or you don't. They test you at an early age. They check your IQ, and because your IQ is really, really high, and because IQ is natural and it is usually biological, and it's something that you cannot attain and change very, very easily when you're at a young age. As a consequence, those that are selected to be geniuses and promoted to be geniuses and given the privileges in schools as geniuses, they are reinforced to be intelligent and smart, the best of the best in schools. And so all our educational resources oftentimes are identified and utilized to promote these particular individuals. So it's a great argument already that this is bad because it promotes that fixed mindset. And those non-geniuses, as a consequence, feel that even if they work hard enough, they simply are not smart. And so they're demotivated over and over again. Now we haven't yet done the framing. The next step here is the framing for why the argument is important, right? I mean, the argument can be true, but it might not really be debate winning. Because right now, as is, opposition could just say we agree, this is okay. Geniuses promoted more, and, non-geniuses, it's okay that they're not prioritized. Because, the opposition might argue that geniuses deserve a lot of these privileges because, they will be lagging behind if they were in normal classes. And non-geniuses, of course, we don't want to give them all the privileges anyways because they can't handle excellent and intelligent classes, right? Of course, right? This is conceded. This is quite easy for opposition to argue. And they could argue all the other things about why this is good because of innovation, because we want to utilize our resources more efficiently. And they might even argue that this is good in general, right? So we want a frame, we want a metric. We want to prove that this argument is very, very important or is the most important thing in this debate. So let's say this. Since parents will still encourage their children to do well on either side, it is better that they do it under a narrative of hard work as opposed to a narrative of praising genius. Because hard work encourages progress and self-belief, which we would argue to be more important in this debate than innovation, than all of these other things that opposition is arguing. Why are we saying this? Why did we need to say this? We needed to say this because it's quite easy for the debate of the glorification of genius to be boggled down by a lot of things, right? People might say, oh, the narrative of genius promotes tiger parenting, or without the narrative of genius, people will be bad parents and all of that stuff, right? They might have all those red herring arguments, or even like the red herring arguments I was telling you earlier, like it's okay to privilege geniuses, or it's okay to privilege or to not privilege non-geniuses because, we want to scale the difficulty according to how they are. But both of those debates miss the point of what we are doing in this argument. They miss the point that parents are well-intentioned on either side, but and schools may be well-intentioned on either side. Schools can be well-intentioned if they're segmenting difficulty, right? They could also be well-intentioned if they are, helping students with hard work and all of those stuff. So the debate is not on whether schools are good or bad or whether parents are good or bad, but it is whether a narrative of hard work, as opposed to praising genius, engenders or promotes this type of progress and self-belief more. Because self-belief is the best way in which we could continuously allow people to participate within educational systems so that we could have a self-sustaining educational system. And that is how we promote more inclusivity. We promote more growth among all of our students. And so that we could continuously bring out the best from all different students. You might ask at this point, like a simple question, right? Oh, how do we debunk this argument now that government has done this type of argument? Well, I hope now you're realizing, like, just for response purposes, like, of course, this isn't the responses lecture, but right now, I hope you're already realizing as a beginner debater, the way to respond to this argument is either to respond to the framing, right? The framing of hard work encourages progress and self-belief, and that the debate is on a narrative of hard work versus praising genius, or whether, like, this actually happens. Like, you might say a narrative of genius doesn't promote a fixed mindset. A narrative of genius is actually compatible with a narrative of hard work. And then you could provide reasons as to why that might be the case. Or you might argue that, a narrative of hard work is simply not that important. Because we would argue that promoting innovation might be more important for XYZ reasons. And of course, that's valid. But the point of this exercise, again, is that if you are going to make an argument, you want to prove it to be the most important within the frame that you are presenting. And so the way to do that is to always tie back. Tie back to your previous argument. Tie back to what is important. Tie back to your metric. Let's go into some examples, if that's fine. Let's say the motion was, this house would allow prisoners to vote. Now, of course, again, we know that the debate is not on whether having prisoners voting is good or bad, nor is it on whether, the right to vote is good or bad in general, right? Let's go immediately to a more contentious question, because I don't want to be boggled down by the first exercise. Let's say you've identified the question as, is it more relevant for us to consider how prisoners have undermined the rights of other people, or whether they should be deserving of the right to vote? Because that might be the debate. Government might argue that prisoners have a right to vote because they are disadvantaged people, right? Like they committed crimes as a consequence of economic conditions that were out of their control. And of course, they shouldn't be punished more and more because of the actions that they've committed. But of course, that's a good argument, right? Like identifying the social injustice that happens here. You might even say that the states have failed them, right? But this argument is not necessarily universal, right? This argument doesn't apply to all prisoners. It doesn't apply to the most battle-hardened prisoners that have really committed egregious crimes against other people. And of course, you haven't identified a clear trade-off yet that this should outweigh the fact that they've caused a grievance against another individual. Like, you could accept that the state has done injustice against them, and you could accept that they might have wanted to commit the crime over and over again, and they might not commit a crime again and again in the future. But opposition could still run a valid argument that says that for this particular period in which they are in prison, they should be stripped of their rights, like their right to mobility that we take away from them because of the fact that they took away rights from others, and people who are victims oftentimes are completely incapacitated of their ability to be able to represent themselves, because either they've been physically incapacitated, they've been harmed, their life has been changed in a way that could never be repaired, and of course this is a damage that is irreparable. And they could exaggerate this, etc., etc. They could talk about all these problems and how that right can never be taken back, and that is why we should have a retributive system of justice, which is why we could take away the right to vote, their political representation. Like, I think like a very strong opposition argument here is that if you've gone from that baseline level, you could evolve that argument within the frame of how it's about public goods, right? Like how the right to democracy, the right to voting, is a vote towards a better society, a vote towards what you idealize to be the world, or a better state, right? You vote because we all have a common understanding of what the better state is, or what a better life is for our community. And so, because someone has violated the public interest by committing a crime, it is clearly identified that they have sacrificed and given up their right to vote because of how they have endangered that public interest. And that's a more advanced, excellent version of the argument of opposition. And so if you were a government and you're framing your argument, let's say you were making the argument that the right to vote is like innate to human dignity, right? And all of that other stuff. You want to frame the argument with respect to the trade-off. With respect to the trade-off of that public interest and that public good. And so here, what I would say is the following. So pause the video here if you've already reached this point and you haven't really thought of a clear answer yet. What I would say here is that we agree that the right to mobility is taken away because you have violated a public interest and that you have committed a crime against another individual. And that is why we deem that to be the case when you are in prison. But the problem of the assumption of opposition is that they say that just because you are in prison, your vote is inherently antagonistic to the interest of the public. We would argue that being in prison is fundamental to their identity at this particular moment in time. That they are also part of what constitutes the public interest. That their lived experience makes up that public experience. And that, furthermore, that criminal justice and the laws in which we have voted those punishments to be the case, those penalties to be the case, are founded on an innate accessibility to all human experience, including those that have been aggrieved and including those that are the perpetrators of these crimes. Because they understand the experience of being imprisoned the most. And so even if they have aggrieved another individual, it is fundamentally incommensurate if you were to take away the right to vote of prisoners, because you are completely alienating one aspect of criminal justice that they are most able to give their political opinion on. And that is why it is more innate. That is why it is more approximate compared to some vague public interest or public good that opposition assumes to be the case that these prisoners presumably vote against. And so I hope that now what we're doing in this argument is that we're approximating. We are narrowing down our value system, right? A while ago, our value system was on right to vote, innate human dignity versus public interest and criminal justice. And then we've unpacked it. We've unpacked what is criminal justice. We've unpacked it in terms of the common good and public interest and victims. And we've also unpacked it in terms of criminal justice for those that are in prison, like rehabilitation and all those other things. And then now we've unpacked it even further. We've unpacked it to say that it is about which rights are more approximate, accessible when someone is voting. When someone is voting, right, as part of their lived experience. And so government is arguing that it's more approximate that their experience in prison should not be alienated compared to the experience of victims and the public interest, because the vote that is being alienated is the vote of one person. And of course, opposition here responds by saying that proximity, right, is not the best standard for judging this debate. Opposition may argue that it's not merely about whether or not those prisoners can approximate what is good for their own lives, but it's on whether or not we want a society where they are able to represent themselves in this particular way. And of course, that is in my opinion, that's a more advanced debate. And it's, again, I want to identify here, it's even for beginner debaters, it is still a very, very good debate that you've already identified it until this point. Doing this is already 75% of the battle won, in my opinion. Making the arguments is the easiest part after this. Alright? Let's say the motion was, this House supports the decline of traditional television. So again, this is the last exercise for this particular second module. I hope we've already gone through the exercise over and over again, and we've already gone through the boats and logs. At this point, we now know the debate is not just on whether traditional television is good or bad, nor is it on whether traditional television is good in a particular context or not, right? Let's play around with the question here. It is more so on whether the decline of traditional television has done more harm than good in a particular context. And so, at this point, I hope you've already begun to ask here that, okay, now I know the debate is not on just whether the shows on TV are good or bad, right? Government may argue about TV is propaganda, TV has outdated stuff, and then opposition may argue that, oh no, social media, which government might argue be a comparative because it's the about the internet and all mainstream social media afterwards. Opposition may argue that social media is also flawed in many ways, and television might be a more controlled space that is easier for people to identify with. They might say social media is more overwhelming and it has echo chambers, and television is relatively more mainstream and more democratic and more accessible to the public in a particular way. But that debate alone is it's too superficial and very, very hard for you to identify what is the debate about. And so if you've already reached a point at this level where you're saying that, oh, the decline of traditional television has competed with social media, and the decline of traditional television allowed for more access to the internet and media streaming on the internet in a way that made traditional television even better and even more accountable, then that's a really, really great argument already. The next step is to just frame the argument to be important. So let's try and do that. Let's say the argument that we would run here is that with the advent of internet, social media, and media streaming, it is the extraction of data and extraction of information that has allowed individuals to better express their preferences online and also find media that pertains to their political beliefs and their entertainment wishes the most. And so you'll argue why that's the case. Of course, it's quite easy to argue why algorithms are very good at pertaining to your preferences. The next question is why that is important. And so here, the framing you might say is, and you could pause the video before this, is that the reason as to why your preferences are important is because a world where the decline did not happen is a world where traditional TV and only a few monopolistic or oligarchic players in the market, including the state, including particular media moguls, have essentially a control over how you think. And this autonomy is a precondition for political decision making, for your preferences, because whether or not you are stuck with certain ideologies and whether ideologies are good or bad, it is the process of you feeling that you are choosing the things that you want that is more important to this debate. And that is why having a plethora of choices, having all of this access that is facilitated through the mass data extraction and algorithms of social media that made it easier for people to contest traditional TV sources, to undermine that power, to undermine the monopolies and oligarchies that were present, so that other entrants in the competitive media market could counterbalance that narrative that was in place. And so, because people's preferences are most important, people's autonomy is most important here in the way in which they design their preferences, we prefer it to be done under a model of social media and preference seeking measures, as opposed to a model of traditional television, wherein the echo chambers created under traditional television are simply much worse. I hope you've realized that this argument is framed to be spectacular, right? In this way, because we're specifying it's about preferences, autonomy. Because even if opposition runs the argument that, oh no, social media is very exploitative as well. Social media takes a lot of data. There's like data privacy problems and all those other things. And if opposition runs the argument that like, oh, there are also echo chambers in social media as well, right? Government's argument is essentially preempting this. Government is saying, yeah, we can also have some echo chambers, but that's not the debate. The debate is on whether the process of reaching these particular echo chambers is good or bad. And we would argue a world with traditional television having the essential corporate monopoly on all of these different types of processes is one in which is less accountable to the way in which people's preferences are sought after. So it's more authoritative, it's more undemocratic, and it's less representative of what they actually want and what they actually believe in. And so having a plethora of choices and multiple seeking competition is better for most people. Okay? So that's the way I would approach this last argument or this last motion for this particular exercise. Let's say that we're doing another one. Let's say the last motion example that we would do is this house refers a world where humans do not have a biological need for sleep. And let's say, so of course it's a very wild motion. It's a very, very strong motion. And whether or not you're into like arguments on whether sleep is actually good or creative or productive for you and all this other stuff, I want you to try and think about this exercise. Let's say you were government side, right? Um, and so opposition is probably like someone that listens to this lecture. And opposition knows the true comparative, and they identify one particular aspect of this debate. Opposition argues that on both sides of the house, labor structures will be very, very, very exploitative no matter what. And so opposition will argue that a world where you do not have a biological need for sleep is a world where people will be overworked more and more and more. And he will argue that this is very, very, very bad and exploitative because there is no biological ceiling that prevents and counterbalances against the worst excesses of corporate manipulation and labor exploitation. So opposition argues that sleep is a great means to promote that counterbalance because sleep is it's very clearly defined, like 8 hours, 6 hours for people every night, and it is relatively universal for everyone. And that is why we need this break, we need this rest for people in the world. So opposition would argue that this is relatively more important than, let's say, an argument at government side, which might be that government is saying that, oh, a world without a biological need for sleep is going to be very, very productive for the world, like super productive, like you have more work. So I hope you understand at this point, at high level, even if it's beginner level debaters arguing this, it's very, very high level, right? Government is arguing that it's a highly productive society. Opposition is arguing that even if it's a highly productive society, it is a more exploitative society for more people. So if you're government, you want to frame your argument in a way that responds to the opposition. You want to frame it to show that your metric is more important than the opposition's metric on labor exploitation. So you might say that, yeah, we agree. Again, you can pause here and then think about this later. We agree that corporations would still want to be exploitative on either side of the house, that they will continuously want people to work more and more on either side of the house. But this debate is less so much about whether the counterbalance of sleep exists or not, but it is about whether or not the extra time that people have outside of the biological need for sleep can be exercised in favor of workers' rights. And we would argue that having the biological need for sleep as your ceiling on opposition disables you from trying to leverage yourself against these corporations. Because now you have less time to protest, you have less time and less demand, like you have less leeway to exercise your restraint against these institutions because you are working less on net compared to our model. And because our model, precisely because it has no ceiling of how much people should work and how much people should sleep, that is exactly where workers are able to leverage the amount of work that they are utilizing every single day. And that work, right, because of how much they are embedded within these corporations, how much they can leverage this collectively among different workers at many points in time, it becomes harder and harder to lay them off. And it also becomes harder and harder for you to exploit them because the work they do will likely be more and more productive, as we have proven in our argument, right? So I hope you realize we've transformed a very brilliant argument already into one that is brilliant and responsive. We've responded to the meat of opposition's argument by saying that productivity is the best way to now counter labor exploitation. And opposition misses the point that workers' rights is only mediated by how productive and how much leverage each worker has. And that is exactly why our argument is prior to theirs, right? That's how you could argue that. Right? I hope you enjoyed that particular exercise, because I think it's also very, very excellent and demonstrative as well. We're going to the last portion of this particular lecture. The last module for this lecture. It's still a pretty chunky one, but I just want to highlight that what we've demonstrated so far in this lecture today is that we have said that, debates are not just black or white. Debates are not just about the X or Y, but it's also about unpacking particular metrics about what the debate is about, and then framing your particular arguments relative to that core contention, why it is most important, right? So a while ago, we did it just with the example of how productivity responds to labor exploitation. And in the prisoner example, we also did it in terms of how democracy and the right to vote is a precondition for a better criminal justice system, right? So here, what we want to now do is execute the argument. We want to actually prove the argument to be the case. The theoretical underpinning, or the theoretical basis for this particular portion, is that debates are, again, the beginners can listen to this part as well and remember this for the rest of your career. Debates are never just about the black or white. Debates are not just about what happens all the time, right? Debates are rarely just about the facts, because the facts are usually agreed on either side, right? The debate is always about likelihood. It's always about proving something to be more likely than not. And so, the way you prove something to be more likely than not is by giving reasons as to why that is the case. And one process for how you can demonstrate that is by simply detailing those reasons and giving more specific characterizations as to why something is the case. This is for your arguments, for even characterizations within characterizations, like let's say a characterization of a stakeholder or a particular process and mechanism, or just for anything, like how the debate is presented. So let me give an example, a superficial one, before we go into this particular example in the slide. If you were to say that a library is productive, let's say that's the argument. The claim is a library is a productive place to go to. You want to give multiple reasons as to why a library is a productive place to study. You might say, number one, it's because there's a rules-based structure that makes it to be the case that it is a quiet place and therefore a productive place, because there's a librarian that will penalize you if you were very, very loud in a library and people follow that rule. That's a very good reason, because you've given a structure that says that people follow rules. This is a rule, and that's why people will make it a productive place to study. Number two, you might say it's a productive place to study because there are a lot of resources in a library. Like there's a lot of research materials. You can search the internet in a library, and there's a lot of long-standing historical documents that are accessible in a library that are not accessible anywhere else. And so you could say that because you have so much access to information and knowledge in a library, it's quite good for your productivity journey. You could research for your papers, you could research for all these things. And that reason, more importantly, is independent of the first reason, right? A librarian can still exist, and that would still make it a productive place, even if there were no books. Even if the library were a little bit louder, but there were still lots of books, it could still be argued to be a productive place. And then lastly, you could say a library is a productive place because, like, a library has a social norm, or people go to a library because they want to study. And so people regulate one another. Because when they go there, they have the expectation that everyone will study and be quiet. And so compared to like the outside or a cafe or the outdoors or a park, people are usually quiet and they self-correct. So even if there's no librarian, they will still be quiet. Even if there's no book accessible, they will still be quiet and they will still be productive. So what's the point, guys? The point of this exercise is we want to show something to be true most of the time. And so that is what we are doing with our arguments. You want to make it harder to respond to by detailing the reasons as to why that is the case. Of course, you don't need to do this all the time, but in general, for beginner debaters, my recommendation is you should do it most of the time, because it gives you the discipline and it trains you to remember that there are not just one source for why an argument is true. There are multiple sources for why an argument or characterization is true. And later on, as you develop your career, as you become more advanced, you identify and remember, oh, how do I improve this argument? And what are the most important reasons I should use and utilize for my speech? And then later on, that's when you develop the intuition how to do that. Let's say the motion was established belief that social media has done more harm than good. And of course, at this point, we know that it's not about whether social media, funnily enough, it's not just about whether it's just good or bad in general, but it's about whether social media is good in a particular context or not. And so, let's say you're making the argument that social media has become extremely addictive, and you've framed it to be the case that addiction is a very, very bad thing. That we have to consider this important in this debate, because if you are addicted to a certain resource, it makes it harder for you to identify other things that are happier in your life, because you are structurally not able to pursue that habit that could have otherwise made you happier outside of social media. So if we can prove that something is addictive, then that is when we win. So you could prove it to be the case as to how it has become extremely addictive. You could say, number one, newsfeed algorithms recommend you content that you will watch more. Number two, there is social pressure to always be online on social media. And number three, there is so much ease at which social media can be used. And then, of course, you could detail that even more. Each and every one of that, you could illustrate that and give all of the reasons as to why this is the case. Like, newsfeed algorithms recommend you content that you will watch more. You could explain how algorithms get more and more of your data. The more and more you watch, the more and more the algorithm knows. And the more and more the algorithm knows you, the more content it recommends that you will always want to watch. And this cycle repeats and repeats and repeats so that you will always be addicted. First point, prove it. Number two, people compare themselves against other individuals. So they always seek for validation. They always seek for approval from others. And there's an incentive mechanism in social media because they want to seek out likes. They want to seek out more and more engagement with more and more of their followers and their users. And so, because they see other people in social media do this as well alongside them, and there's a competitive incentive to do so, they always feel pressured to always go on social media, even if they're not an influencer. So everyone always feels the need to go to social media. There's an inclination, even if they otherwise would not want to. And so you'd argue that that is how it contributes to addiction. And then lastly, because technology makes it the case that it's all integrated in your apps, all integrated in your phone, and it's quite easy and becomes easier and easier for people to always access social media because of how it integrates with every part of your daily life. And so all these reasons make social media addictive. I hope that you're learning at this point that what we are doing here when we are proving something to be more likely to be the case is that we are demonstrating that there are multiple sources for something to be the case. And when we look out for those sources, our heuristic must always be, okay, is this a powerful source? Is this something that is connected to the argument? And if I say this, does it meaningfully make the argument more powerful or less powerful? And I hope that as you realize that, you don't really need a million reasons for why something is true. You just need very few powerful reasons, usually 2 or 3, as to why something is very, very strong. And so, at this point, as beginner debaters, the critical thinking process, like the most rigorous, engineered part of thinking is this part. Everything we've said before this, framing, strategy, contextualization, in my opinion, is more strategy, development of intuition, really critically thinking what is the debate. Like, that is the most difficult part. This part, in my opinion, is the easiest part to train because it's just about engineering more reasons, producing more reasons, and I hope you don't stress yourself too much on this because it's quite easier for you to get the hang of this as you get familiar with more and more motions, become more and more familiar with the world, because I know everyone knows this to be true at some level. Everyone here knows that social media is addictive because of these reasons. And so it's quite intuitive that you could also practice that more and more. Let's do it for some examples, huh? Let's do it for some examples to cap off this presentation. Let's say the motion where this house would allow corporations to run cities. And you are running the argument that corporations are going to be very, very efficient compared to political institutions in running those cities. So you want to give the reasons as to why governments are structurally less efficient than corporations, right? I mean, I want you to remember at this point, right, that we've already framed that efficiency is the most important thing in this debate. Let's assume that we've already framed that the true comparative of this debate is that, we want that representation is only fulfilled at the point in which the city is very, very productive and very, very efficient. So we've already done all that good hard work, and now we just want to prove that corporations are more efficient. So number one, you might say that corporations are more efficient because of their concentration on the bottom line and profit, because they have a clear direct incentive to do so, compared to governments wherein they have multiple priorities competing at the same time. And that is why it is very, very difficult for them to always be very direct and very strategic with how they utilize projects. Number two, corporations exist more long-term compared to political institutions and political governments because there are election cycles structurally to be the case, and campaigns disrupt long-term projects, whereas corporations, they have, like, board of directors have longer tenure because they're invested for a very, very long time. And because corporations, the identity stays the same, and their bottom line and operations and clear capacity stays the same. And then lastly, you might argue that government institutions face a lot of red tape and a lot of government bureaucracy and approval processes compared to a corporation, which is more aligned with just seeking for approval through the hierarchy that is pre-designed, like having a CEO that responds directly to fulfill the needs and obligations of a board of directors, and that board of directors votes on resolutions directly over and over again. And so the decision-making process is more itemized and more efficient in a corporation relative to a political institution or a government, which is relatively more boggled down by more and more of these institutions that are overlapping with different interests and people that are always changing occupation all the time. So, of course, at this point, I hope you're realizing it's just the game of producing more and more reasons. We just want to keep on getting the hang of this, and that's what we want to do. Let's do it again. Let's say the motion was this house regrets the commercialization of self-care. And of course, vis-a-vis the first two examples and the first two modules, we know that the debate is not whether or not self-care is good or bad, whether or not commercialization is good or bad in general. But now we want to identify, let's say the argument was the commercialization of self-care impedes on a better understanding of what self-care is. And so you want to argue as to how this becomes the case. So number one, let's think about different institutions and different structures that contribute this to be the case. What is commercialization? We know commercialization is about commercial institutions. We know it's about profit, about transactions. It's about how people want to make it more and more mainstream to the public and more digestible to the public. So let's think about different sources for how that might be the case. Number one, in the argument that it impedes in a better understanding of self-care, number one, we might say that influencers and on social media, they have an incentive to be viral, to oversimplify, to continuously gatekeep an understanding of self-care that their communities of influencers only know to themselves, and they have a competitive incentive for this to be the case because they want people to buy their products, buy their mentorship programs for their own definition of what self-care is. So of course this contributes to the argument because we're saying that virality, oversimplification, all of these things through transaction and buying it, all through facilitated of the institution of influencers and social media, inevitably waters down what self-care is because of more and more people competing on the definition of self-care, and even making it more commercial and more expensive for people to understand and access what self-care is. That's one. That's just one reason influencers and social media undermine self-care. And number two, you might say that, the commercialization of self-care also involves how institutions continuously try and market self-care as as something that can be bought, rather than something that is fostered in their homes or something that they can already have access to, because the commercialization implies that people want to make a profit out of it. So while earlier we were talking about how they market it, like on social media, now it's about the pricing aspect on it and how they sell it to more and more people, right? Like how they want to create products that are self-care based. That when you buy it, you already feel that you're fulfilling one step of the process of reaching self-care. And so you might argue at the opposition that, yeah, you might feel a bit more fulfilled, but this is not a true fulfillment for a lot of people, because the commercialization of self-care impedes on that process, because people don't have enough money all the time. And then of course that's later on in the argument, but you're already identifying here that because it's expensive, because it's very, very highly marketed and highly gatekept, people still don't understand what self-care is. And then of course you can provide more and more reasons. Of course that's up to you at this point. But at this point, we've already identified two very good ones on influencers and also on the commercialization and corporate process of selling it. Let's do another one. The last one, last example for this entire presentation. Let's say the motion was, this house believes that marriage is incompatible with feminism. And at this point, you might have already reached the true comparative of saying that, it's not about whether marriage is good or bad, or whether marriages are going to be good, whether they're fulfilling. Like, some marriages can be very bad, some marriages can die early, some marriages can die very late. It's not even whether states should promote marriage or not, right? It's also not about whether feminism is good or bad, right? It's about whether marriage can align with fundamental values of feminism. And so you might argue at government side that this debate is about whether feminism this debate about whether marriage enables freer choice and more empowerment, more economic empowerment, political empowerment, social empowerment for women. And so if we were to make the argument that marriage fundamentally undermines economic empowerment for women, you might say it in a few ways. Number one, because the social aspect of marriage is one in which it is inherently inseparable from many religious institutions that oftentimes are also patriarchal and have also delegated and framed religion as one in which many of the decision-making process should be done and handled by a man. And so, because socially this contributes in the way religion most likely manifests in the real world, many of the economic decisions in marriage are also done on that basis as well. So we've tied a social institution to the economic argument that we are making. Number two, you might say that marriage, even if states try and make laws that distribute rights in marriage, the problem is that many states historically have been represented by many male institutions and political leaders that have been male strongmen. Even in conservative countries, authoritarians, or even in democratic countries, those that are male dominated as well. Or even, if not, they're also built from historical institutions and property that have also been delineated on the basis of economic empowerment for men, like just the gender pay gap, or also even the fact that men have owned a lot of property more than women because of inheritance and because of previous gender inequalities that have also compounded over time. So here you'd argue that marriage does not facilitate redistribution. Marriage actually enables the exacerbation of these processes, because now because men already own most of the property in those marriages, they also hold a lot more power because marriage affirms that to be the case, because it doesn't encourage women to own more property, because now it's conjugal property as a consequence. So most of the time, the leverage still favors men. And then, of course, there are multiple more reasons you could do here. Economic empowerment on, like, the fact that marriage structurally leads to having more families and children, and oftentimes because the women are expected to work in the household more than the men, and the norms are not changing most of the time, men will always earn more of a living wage compared to women, and that is why the distribution of economic resources in marriage would also not be done in an asymmetric in a symmetric way. All of these other things contribute only to the argument on economic empowerment. If you are opposition at this point, I hope you realize that in this battle game of engineering, so many reasons you have to continuously build, right? I hope you realize that now at this point, the strategic move for you is not to only, like, battle each and every reason, but even in a beginner level, you already want to know that the core question that the argument is asking is whether marriage facilitates better economic redistribution, or does it enable economic inequality. And so you would respond by simply saying that no, we don't think that those inequalities compound over time. We think, for example, many states have allowed for laws to be reformed, and marriage as an institution has become more egalitarian. And so conjugal property actually does enable fair economic decision making. And so we think that's good. You could also argue that more household decisions are being made by men in a vast majority of marriages. And that is why we cannot argue to be the case that marriage all the time disables economic empowerment. That's one way you could respond. The other way you could respond is simply by saying that we think that feminism is not merely about only whether past economic empowerment has been disabled, right? Whether injustice happened or not, but whether marriage is a better institution than anything else. And of course, that's an entirely different debate, right? Whether marriage, given the social pressure that we'll discuss on either side, allows that to be the case on facilitating better economic empowerment or not, or women empowerment or not. So, of course, this is the last exercise I wanted to give for this particular presentation. But I wanted to end this particular segment and this particular module only by saying that I hope that you don't get lost in building all the reasons. Debate can get addicting because you just have to build a lot of reasons sometimes, right? And, you might want to spam it. But that's not what we're doing here. I hope that if you have really, really thought through the motion, if you have really, really thought through what you want to argue and what you want to really prove in a debate, then I hope at this point you've realized that it gets harder and harder. That you don't need to just build more reasons. You want to build more reasons that specifically align with the core contention that you wanted to address. And I think that is where I think debating really does have its layers, have its layers of difficulty. So whether you're a beginner debater, whether you're an intermediate one or an advanced one, I hope that this presentation has taught that, debating is such a deep, extremely complex sport that while it is so comprehensive in what it tackles, everything it does, it also is remarkably simple. And the brilliance of core contentions, true comparatives, framing, it all comes from really, really, really asking what the debate is about. And then that's what I hope you have fun in doing. Like, there's a joy to the process, there's a joy in improving, a joy in getting it all done. I've been debating for a long time, and I wanted to make this lecture just as a starting point for a lot of people to really get into the hang of what debating and thinking if debating is gonna be like. And this is just only one small tidbit of the process. Or in other words, it actually is everything about the process. This is all good. And I hope you enjoy debating, and good luck. Whoever sent you this video, please spread it to more people, and thank them as well. And don't forget to subscribe and also enjoy the rest. Alright, that should pretty much be it for today's presentation. Thank you everyone. Have a wonderful day. Bye bye.